all here, within just a few blocks of Washington Square, over a very, can you all hear me okay? Over a very long period of time, lived an amazing array of women. There were groups of people who were African American, Irish, Italian. There were working class women, there were society women, there were factory women and academic women. Amazing, and some of the most notable women of the United States lived very, very close to the square. I don't know if there's another place in the country that had this reputation. So here it is, here's the village, and at the very western end, from 1797 to 1829, was an institution called Newgate Prison. It was for men and for women, and if you were not convicted of a capital crime, they taught you a trade, so maybe you wouldn't come back to jail. This is what it looked like, and there's an image of it that I'm sure many of you have seen enormous numbers of times. The Christopher Street subway station, that is Newgate Prison on the wall of the #1 train. So if you were convicted of one of the capital crimes, and I think they were boiled down to just 3 after the Revolution, murder, treason, and stealing from a church poor box, I always wondered how many they got on that count, you would be marched over to what is now Washington Square Park and hanged. And so, as many of you know, the park was a graveyard after the American Revolution. It took quite a long time for many people to move their residences to that neighborhood. 1624 is when the Dutch first settled Manhattan. They settled south of the protective wall. Of course, that's Wall Street. By the 1820s, the line of settlement had extended up the island so that Soho, as it's now called, was the most populated residential part of town. But well-to-do people usually led the movement north on the 13-mile island of Manhattan to get away from the noise and all of the industry and other things that seemed to follow them. So in the 1820s, the graveyard is covered over. As you know, they just found some more crypts a week ago. History is very present in a lot of ways. And they named it in 1826 for George Washington because that was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So the row at Washington Square North there included some of the wealthiest people in town. And during the daytime, a lot of the older sons and husbands worked downtown, and so it was something of a world of women in Washington Square. A lot of the daughters went to the same schools, a lot of the women visited one another, and that is what the row went up for in 1833. So these would be some of the daughters of Washington Square, and interestingly enough, some things change a lot, but by having the row at Washington Square North, it sort of kept the identity of the area of town just north of the square as, prime Greenwich Village, as real estate people call it today. It's still some of the most expensive part of the city. Now, these were philanthropic women, many of them, and during the Civil War, some of the wealthiest women of the row worked to supply people in the Union Army with food, with clothing, especially things having to do with their health on the battlefield, sanitation, etc. So they were very activist from the very beginning. Now, in 1850, 52% of Manhattan, and I use the term Manhattan and New York interchangeably, because you may know it wasn't until 1898, with a slight exception before that, that the boroughs joined Manhattan to become greater New York City. But in 1850, 52% of the city was foreign-born. Half that number came from Ireland. So much of New York history, of course, has to do with what was happening elsewhere in the world. And the ships just landed at the dock. There was no immigrant landing station until 1855, at which point they start using Castle Garden over there, which has been abbreviated now to Castle Clinton downtown. and they just landed at the docks. And some of the people who met them at the docks were some of the wealthy women of Washington Square North, and they hired the women as maids right on the spot, supplanting some of the African American women who had been in the servant class of that area prior to that. No Irish need apply. There was a great antipathy to a lot of the Irish, and partly I think it's because for most of the 119 years we were a British colony, it was illegal to be a practicing Catholic in New York. But I think that in a city of 813,000 by 1860, 200,000 of them came from barely escaping Ireland with their lives. And people often want to put down the poor rather than help them. And about the only legal job for more than a generation Irish men could get in New York was doing heavy backbreaking labor. And about the only legal job Irish women could get was live-in domestic service. So these would be some of the women that you might see at Washington Square North or at the square. You know, St. Joseph's Church, Roman Catholic Church on 6th Avenue, went up in 1833, presumably for some of the servants who were beginning to come into town. Should say that African Americans had been in the village before anybody else. Blacks were brought in 1626 to do mainly farming, because everybody was making a fortune on the fur trade. Who wants to farm? That's work. So blacks were brought into the city to do that. And 18 years later, some of them were given freedom, or at least half freedom, at least for one generation. And where they lived, they were given land in the outlying district to farm, and then they had to give some of what they farmed to the lower city. Along Minetta Water. That was an African American community for a very long time. The original owner of Washington Square was an African American of 1644, had it only for one generation. So this is a woman who's been called Aunt Sally. By the 1840s, in the south part of Greenwich Village, you had the first African theater in the country, and you had an African American newspaper that was being printed right here. So the black population, Gay Street also retained a black identity into the 20th century. Well, Bohemia, this was one of the first Bohemians to come to the village, certainly so much part of its reputation today. Her name was McElhenney. She came from South Carolina. Her family had money until the Civil War. Then when they lost it, she went to the stage. What else could a woman do to survive? And she took up a fabulous stage name for a Southern woman, Ada Clare. Ada Clare, that was her name. And they said, what is it to be a Bohemian? She said, it means I'm not a victim of feeling or good taste. I think we can learn from a lot of these women, anything that is grabs your fancy. She liked to do things that other people didn't do. She hung out with some of the radicals at FAF, P-F-A-F-F'-S, literally underground at Bleecker and Broadway. Other people who hung out there included Walt Whitman, Horace Greeley, and she wore her hair short. We're not talking the 1920s, we're talking the 1850s. She checked into a hotel in Paris and proudly signed the register, Miss Clare and Son. She had a flagrant affair with the composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk. So just breaking the rules. If other people do it, I want to do something original. And we're talking the 1850s. There was some publishing just east of the square. And that's why Walt Whitman and others were in the neighborhood. So this was an original crowd that she liked to be around. And then there was this woman, who, Ida Menken. She was on the stage because the Bowery and areas a little bit to the west was where the theater was in the 19th century. And she figured out a very convincing way to be wildly successful. Byron had written a long poem about a Cossack leader called Mazeppa, who was punished in the end of the poem by being strapped to the back of a horse and let the horse run wild. Well, wearing not a lot, especially for the 1860s, she had herself strapped to the back of a horse in the theater, and the horse ran with her on its back up and down the aisles and then ended up on the stage. And you can imagine how successful and popular she was, some of the original characters. Well, this is a street that you may recognize. This is McDougal Street, across from the Reggio. And this was a rooming house in the 1850s. One of the people who stayed there was Bronson Alcott, who didn't think it was up to him. He was a transcendentalist, didn't think it was up to him to support his family. So his daughter, Louisa May Alcott, supported the family. And that's also a running theme of a lot of the women of Washington Square. They often supported their husbands, the family, until they couldn't sometimes any longer. So in her early days, under a pen name, A.M. Barnard, she wrote swashbuckling accounts about pirates and other things, and whoever had mistreated people got their payback. That was the kind of thing that she was very successful at. And then her editor said, don't you think you could write something for children? And Little Women, which she wrote some of on McDougal Street, I mean, she was a literary figure, and I'll be talking about a few literary figures now, that you don't even connect often with New York, you connect her with New England, but Little Women was written to some extent right there in a building that I believe the NYU Law School now owns. This is Louisa May. Well, north of the square was the Lazarus family, and Emma Lazarus. Her family and some of the people were new immigrants in the Washington Square area, and some of them had families that went back very, very far. Emma Lazarus' Jewish family first came to New York in the 1650s. 1654 is when the first Jewish people came to town. She didn't have a particular Jewish consciousness. She was a poet. But with the pogroms in Eastern Europe of the 1880s, she started writing poetry about that. And when they were trying to raise money for the base of the Statue of Liberty, you know, the French people spent $400,000 to give us the Statue of Liberty, but we had to come up with $100,000 for the base. We almost didn't take the Statue of Liberty. And she wrote a 140-line poem, The New Colossus, with the famous words that are now inscribed on the base of the statue: give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And she changed the meaning, really, of the statue. It was presented to us as something about liberty, thanking America for our American Revolution, which in turn inspired the French one. But she called her the mother of immigrants, and so a very different switch. She did not live to age 40. She died before the statue was unveiled in 1886, and she never lived to see that her words would be inscribed on it.
Did she marry and have children?
No, she did not either. This is Edith Wharton. Now, most of the women that I'm talking about came from someplace else. Almost every place on the East Coast, people came to feel, when they read about Greenwich Village, particularly in that pre-World War I period, I belong there, I don't belong where I am. But Edith Wharton moved from 23rd Street. She was born on 23rd Street in 1862. That was the posh neighborhood. She was a Jones, and you know the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses" was written about her, referred to her great aunt. But she moved to 7 Washington Square North briefly after her father died. She and her mother lived there while the will was being probated. There are just so many ways to see the past. One, of course, is to learn history. One is to look at paintings, poetry, plays, all the people that came into the square area. And urban archaeology, of course, again, just in the news, is yet another way. So here she is. You can identify where she was born today. It's on 23rd, about 4 buildings west of 5th Avenue. It's been added to and now is a Starbucks. And Miss St. Vincent Millay, she came from Maine to Vassar to Greenwich Village. And for many people, she wrote the pre-World War I poetry that was the spirit of the place. For example, you know, my candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night. but my friends and all my foes, I think I twisted some words there, it casts a lovely light. And quite beautiful. She and her also beautiful sister Norma were in the original production of Desire Under the Elms. So today, of course, we know her as a poet. In 1923, for example, she becomes the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for poetry. But people of the village first knew her as an actor. Willa Cather, she was raised in Nebraska and moved to Greenwich Village to write about Nebraska. If that is not a draw. The solid character of the people of the Midwest. She moved to Washington Square South, then she moved to Washington Place west of the park. Then she moved to Bank Street, a building that has since been demolished, by 7th Avenue South, although there is a plaque on the building near where she had been. And wonderful writer. She came to work at McClure's magazine. She was in Pittsburgh teaching and writing, and McClure came through, and he had a magazine in New York where a writer could write 10,000 words if they wanted to. And a lot of these people who are flooding into the village at that time wrote for McClure's. She was his editor for a while. I always thought she had a perfect life for a writer after she became successful, and she also wins a Pulitzer for her novel, One of Ours. She would go shopping in the morning at the Jefferson Market, and then the French maid would come in to make dinner, to make lunch. And she also was able to rent the apartment above her so nobody would be clomping over her head. Jane Heap wrote a magazine. She lived on 8th Street with her partner. And she saw the brilliance of Ezra Pound and of others that Ulysses, she put out Ulysses in installments. And the federal government, you know, there was always a problem with the federal government in those days because they thought a lot of things were obscene and you were not allowed to send obscenity through the mails. So they took over a few of her issues of Ulysses, but she kept publishing it the whole time the trial was on. And she was found guilty, but had a very nominal sentence or a fine or something. So very colorful character. On your left is Marianne Moore, poet, largely connected more with Brooklyn than with Manhattan, but she was a part-time librarian at the Hudson Park Library. She lived on St. Luke's Place. That's her mother. They were very close together. She lived on St. Luke's Place, then moved to Brooklyn, and then moved back to just north of Washington Square. So, of course, this library has multiple books on almost everybody I'm mentioning, so I hope I'm piquing some of your interest to look further. Now, this is a woman who came from Iowa, Susan Glassbell. She and her husband, George Crown Cook, begin the Provincetown Playhouse, so now we're in the theater area. And it was just before, I think it was 1914, that she and some other writers, although not particularly theater people, were in Provincetown, Massachusetts, complaining about the Broadway theater. They said that the Broadway theater doesn't require anything of the audience, it doesn't have any literary merit, so they tried to put on plays of their own that didn't have the requirement of making money, but they weren't theater people, the plays weren't that good. The next summer, she said, does anybody have real plays? A guy said, I came up with this 26-year-old, a trunk full of his plays, never published, never produced. It was Eugene O'Neill. So the next fall, they move, Provincetown Playhouse comes to McDougal Street. And Trifles, if you haven't read her story, Trifles, it is really quite striking. How many of you have read Trifles? Excellent. It's how things look different to women than they do to men. It's an interesting thing. So that's McDougal Street. And that was a whole complex of buildings, Provincetown on the right, and other of the institutions of that World War I period, the Liberal Club and other things, all in that row. Well, Emily Post, you can just tell by looking at her that she lived north of Washington Square. Her father was an eminent architect named Bruce Price, but her husband had an affair with, I think, a burlesque person, so she divorced him, and a lot of the wealthy women did not feel they could divorce. But she had to make some money, so she comes up with one of the biggest sellers of all times in America, The Complete Guide to Etiquette at Home, in Business, in Politics. I mean, still being published by her, I think, daughter-in-law or something. But she pushed for women to have the vote, but I was reading that she also knew how high the tea table was supposed to be. That's Washington Square North. Well, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, this is a wonderful painting of her by Robert Henry, and I recently took this directly from the original after Dean Whitney. She married a guy who, in 1907, inherited, I think, $200 million, decided she didn't only want to be social uptown, she wanted to learn to sculpt, and all of these artists were streaming in, and she had the wild idea that maybe you should support artists when they were living. Nobody was doing that. They just spent a lot for their paintings after they died. In 1930, she had collected something like 800 works of living American artists, not only offered that collection to the Met, but money with which to build a wing for that collection. The Met said, living American artists, no thank you, and that is the origin of the Whitney Museum. American Art, it was the first museum in the country for only American artists. Wonderful picture here, and this was quite shocking to many. A kind of an odalesque pose, sort of wearing pajamas. Her husband would not allow this to hang in their house. And of course, New York Studio School on 8th Street, which you can still visit. I should have a picture, I have so many pictures in the show, but it's beautifully deco inside. And there's even a picture, I think, as you go in right on the right of what it looked like when there was statuary there and when she had it as the first Whitney. So the Whitney then moves up to 54th Street, then to Madison. And this is what it looked like when people came to see these new people. Modern art was really introduced to America in 1913 at the Armory Show, in the Armory that's still there at Lexington and 26th Street. And she bought the majority of the pictures. She also did things like if an artist couldn't pay to go to Paris to expand his style and his ability, she would sometimes support them in Paris so that they could have that opportunity. Just so many ways of being female, you might say. And there were a number of ways that women got together. And this woman, Anne Lynch, is said to have possibly started the first literary salon in the country. She lived just west of the square, and her husband taught at Otto. He had been in the Sardinian Parliament, and then he taught at NYU. And she brought together people like Edgar Allan Poe and Melville. Again, we're talking the 1840s here, soon after people moved to Greenwich Village. And she was a very sensitive person, and she was very good at getting people talking with each other. So there are a number of ways, it seems to me, that some of the women of Washington Square did things that other women didn't do. But it also seems to me that a lot of them did things that are traditionally women's ideas, women's work, but they did it in a different way. So for example, she, how many women haven't put on parties and gotten everybody to feel good, but she had literary people, so just that little important difference. Mable Dodge, of course, a much more famous salon. Mable Dodge and her husband came from Buffalo, New York. They went to Paris, and she became friendly with Gertrude Stein. Her husband wanted to come back to America, to New York, and she did not want to come. But what they do is rent a couple of floors of brownstone on 9th Street and 5th Avenue. And she was very bored, but she had a couple of friends who gave her advice. One was Walter Lippmann, and one was the muckraker Lincoln Steffens. And Lippmann said, why don't you have people over one day a week, and that'll be good for you. And Steffens said, why don't you come up with a topic each week, and maybe you can bring in a speaker, and people that are interested in that topic will come. And so that was the start of the very influential Mable Dodge salon. A lot of people who had never spoken about certain subjects in public came to her salon to talk. Brill talked about Freudianism. Margaret Sanger talked about birth control. Amy Lowell talked about a new kind of poetry. Big Bill Haywood, who had organized some of the miners in the American Southwest, talked about unionizing. And not only was this fascinating to people, but it was very media friendly. So newspapers all over the country started writing up the Mable Dodge salon, not only these wild subjects, but it was taking place in the Fifth Avenue brownstone, and so the contrast made for good news. And that meant that people in all parts of the US reading that might say, you know, I belong there, I don't belong where I am. And so the Mable Dodge salon had a big effect on bringing in more people to this kind of creative fervor that was the village. She then goes to Taos and starts the art colony in Taos after she and Jack Reed break up. And he goes off with Diane Keaton, you may remember that. So this is an interesting woman. Her name is Jenny Howe. She was a Unitarian minister. Her husband ran Ellis Island. And in 1912, she had an interesting idea that maybe you would like to pick up on. She started a luncheon club, unique luncheon club for unorthodox women. And they met every other week except for the summer from 1912 to the beginning of World War II. They were all diverse in many ways. Some of them were DAR, long-time Americans, hundreds of year Americans. Some of them were immigrants. These were women who pretty much made their own money. They were journalists, they were teachers, they were lawyers. And whenever I say lawyers, it's all sorry. So they just discussed things, and they disagreed, and they loved arguing, and they loved disagreeing. Agnes DeMille was a member. She was the youngest member, the choreographer, because her mother was also a member. It was quite an amazing thing. They didn't leave. There is even a book, I understand, downstairs in this library on reserve called Heterodoxy. That was the name of the club. And it was quite amazing. People just went and found support and just enjoyed themselves. So I'm very interested in how people come together and learn from one another in this kind of period. That was a rooming house started by a woman whose son was an artist. They moved here from Syracuse, and she liked creative people. Madame Branchard's, they called it Madame Branchard's House of Genius. So many creative people were there. Stephen Crane lived there for a while, and Adelina Patti, the Metropolitan Opera star, and it was just wonderful. It's now been replaced by the Student Center at NYU without a plaque. I said that to somebody, they should put a plaque there. They said the plaque would be too big, but I think they did. One of the people who lived there was Rose O'Neill. She was an artist, and she creates the Cupid doll. And she was considered a catalyst of Bohemia. The song Rose of Washington Square is apparently about her. It's kind of a racy song about artists who pose nude for the artist, models who pose nudes for the artist, which she didn't really do. But she creates the Cupid doll, and what 1920s carnival could have a contest without it. But she was one of the people who supported her own family, but then when the Depression came, people were not buying Cupid dolls, and so she went broke. Her archives is in the College of the Ozarks, which is why it says that. There were other gathering places. Grace Godwin, I love this picture because they're learning how to deal with spaghetti. But she had a eatery just south of Washington Square, and she had little children. She had 4 little children who went around and tried to sell things. She was selling the idea of Greenwich Village as a wild place and tourist friendly. So she was one of the first to do that. Polly Holiday came from Illinois, and she had anarchist waiter named Hippolyte Havel, who ends up having a long affair with Emma Goldman. And when you sat down, when he served you, he would always say, "Take that, you bourgeois pig." They would go, if he didn't say it, she would say the same. And I just noticed this month that on McDougal Street, there's a, I guess, fairly new restaurant called the Bourgeois Pig. So they're picking up Holly Holiday. And she would have speakers also on different themes. Ashley Lindsay, the poet, and others. Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. I always think they didn't serve meat that day. Madame Bocciolotti. This was also for something like 10 cents. Artists could get very thick minestrone soup and a glass of wine and a lot of bread. She charged other people more, but she was very much in favor of artists. So this was her place, hers and her husband's. Now, in the 1890s, a lot of Italians moved to Greenwich Village. Well, of the 12 million people who came through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1924, 2.5 million of them came from southern Italy. So there were many little Italies around town, but the African Americans had basically left that neighborhood, which in 1865, the area south of the square was called Little Africa. But by the 1870s, 80s, they pretty much moved to the West 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that was a time that sort of opened it up to a lot of Italian immigrants coming in. So you might think this is Italy, and then you see New York Post Office there. And like many immigrants, they turn a little corner of Manhattan into something that looks a little bit like home. I always love that line of the movie Hester Street. The woman is here for 3 months living in the Lower East Side and turns to her husband and says, "But where are the Americans?" And there was a little bit of this as well. A lot of the Italians moved to different streets, of course, depending on what part of Italy they came from, because Italy was unified as a country only in the 1870s. So people not only identified more with their part of Italy, but even their parish. I always remember the story that Martin Scorsese tells about his parents. They both came from Sicily. They both moved to a very Sicilian street in New York, Elizabeth Street. But when they married each other, it was considered an intermarriage because they came from different parishes. Very interesting. So suddenly the street life changes. You know, every immigrant group brings new foods, new ideas, new everything. And a lot of outdoor festivals, push carts. This is the sound you would have heard on the streets. Now this is a picture that interests me a lot because it means very different things to different people. What you're looking at is an Italian family in the tenement apartment making artificial flowers for her house. To the family, this is a very positive scene. The kids are not in school, where very often Protestant teachers tell them what's wrong with being poor and Italian and Catholic. And the family is a very important Italian unit, and so here they're keeping an eye out on the kids. They're giving the ethics to the kids that they want those kids to have. The kids are helping to support their family and learning a skill with which they'll be able to support their nuclear family later on. But to one of the progressives, this is terrible. Those kids should be in school. You have child labor. How do you control everything? So even though a lot of different people want what's best is often much in dispute. Well, NYU starts in 1831 downtown. This is the first building, the Gothic Tower, as they called it, built where NYU main building is today at Washington Square East, and this goes up in 1835. Definitely NYU is a big piece of what makes Greenwich Village, what made Greenwich Village what it is. People come as students, people are there as teachers, and it starts with 6 professors, including the first art professor in the United States, none other than Samuel F.B. Morse, who sort of couldn't make it as an artist, invents the Morse code, improves the telegraph. But this is where Winslow Homer taught painting, Walt Whitman taught poetry, and there were no female students there until a few in the 1870s joined the arts department. It's not really until 1890 that they start a new department called the School of Pedagogy, the Ed School. By the next year, 15% of the student body is female. They moved their main campus to the Bronx, the West Bronx, University Heights section of the Bronx, in the 1890s, when the neighborhood starts getting more industrial. The university thought that that was no longer a good place for their students, particularly their undergraduates, and the Heights campus, which they sell in the 70s, did not admit women until 1959. Now, women were not allowed in the law school. The law school of NYU begins in 1835, but in 1890, they start a law class so that women, who of course will never be lawyers, can learn about the law. And one of the women who studied there is this woman, Emily Roebling. Now, her father-in-law had the idea for the Brooklyn Bridge, more than twice as long as the next longest single-span suspension bridge in the world, when it opened in 1883. But 3 weeks, or well, I guess within a month, John Roebling dies of lockjaw after his foot is crushed by a passing tugboat. Emily's husband, Washington Roebling, directs the building of the Brooklyn Bridge for 4 years, and then he gets the bends. They were trying to figure out why is everybody getting sick and sometimes dying coming up after being under the pressure of the water. They had to figure out what the bends were while they were going ahead with the bridge. For the next 10 years, he told her everything about building this absolutely state-of-the-art construction, and for 10 years, she went to the foreman, had to answer all the questions, was not even mentioned on opening day of the bridge. And she goes to the women's law class at NYU, and she won a contest for a good essay. And the essay was about how few rights in America women have. She said it was like in the Hindu lands where a woman is burned on the pyre when her husband dies, that she's classed legally with incompetence and children, and Emily wrote an amazing woman. Other schools in the neighborhood, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female doctor in the United States, starts the Women's Medical College. At the time of the Civil War, it was on Broadway, just south of Astor Place, and she taught women to be doctors. She had studied in Geneva College upstate. The men who were the students at Geneva had to vote to accept a woman as a student, and they thought it was a put-on by a competing college, and so they said, oh yes, let her in. And of course she was valedictorian at the end, but she prepared nurses for the Civil War, which had there were no nurses in the city. Who was doing the nursing? Other patients, prostitutes. If you were convicted of being a prostitute, you often had the choice of going to jail or working as a nurse for 10 days. So she changed. Well, the new school starts in 1919, and it was the first school in the United States for adult education. Not to be hierarchical, John Dewey came down from Columbia University to help start it. And of course, that's had a very creative effect on the city as well. Hannah Arendt, University in exile, some of the luminaries, intellectual luminaries of Europe who were able to get out of Europe in the 1930s, taught there. Banality of evil, I guess is her famous phrase about the Nazi life. This is Bernice Abbott. She, like many of the people I've mentioned, went to college, studied in Europe, lived in Europe. I haven't gone into all of that, but Bernice Abbott was a wonderful photographer, and there are many books about Greenwich Village. She lived in the West Village that you can follow. She studied with Man Ray in Paris. Martha Graham, who changes classical ballet, taught at the New School. Now, not very far from Washington Square were the department stores. The Ladies' Mile, they called it, and it was Macy's at 14th and 6th, it was A.T. Stewart's And this is A.T. Stewart. Stewart House is now on the site of what for 10 years was the largest department store in the world, or in the country anyway, and that's A.T. Stewart on the right. There were 900 women seamstresses of employment population of about 2,000 people. So seamstress, that's what women could do if they wanted, if they had to work out of the house and do something legal. Now, of course, especially among the Italians, again, family was very much focused, and once a woman had kids, she often wanted to work, or at any rate did work at home, again, keeping an eye out on the kids. But these were the sweatshops. You know, a tenement apartment was like 325 square feet, and many people could live there, and then when they went out in the daytime, it turned into a kind of factory. And women were sweated. There was such intense competition and such a low profit margin that women were forced to work faster and faster and didn't make much money at all. Another tenement view of a sweatshop. But then in 1889, for the first time, we used steel in buildings in New York. It was 50 Broadway. It's now a newer building. That's the UFT headquarters downtown. But that meant that owners could get fire insurance if they built high buildings with steel. So to the east, just to the east of Washington, of NYU, a lot of these factories go up. And they were very crowded. The ceilings were high. If there was any rule about how much cubic feet of air you needed, you could get it. But if there was a fire, you could be in big trouble. This was a progressive era. There were very few rules about safety in the house, in the home, or business. There was a lot of fighting went on to bring that about. Now, in 1909, the women of one of the biggest factories led the first woman-led strike for better working conditions in the United States. This is a picture inside the Great Hall of Cooper Union. The union leader, Samuel Gompers, is saying, this is not a time to strike, we have to be cautious. But it was Clara Ludwig, the woman in the middle there, who had been beaten up by the police when she was on strike. She was helped to climb to the stage at Cooper Union and said, we have to strike now. 20,000 people, the uprising of the 20,000, but the union was underfinanced. It was a cold winter, and they get very few advances. Union movement. The ILGWU had been established in 1900, so that was around at this time. And those are shirtwaist blouses. They are what women of all classes wore at this period. They tucked the very thin cotton blouse into their skirts. The cotton was called lawn. Have you heard of L-A-W-N? I found out the origin of the word. It's from lingerie, very filmy, very flyaway, very flammable. And the largest place that made shirtwaist blouses was just half a block east of the square. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was at the northwest corner of Green Street and Washington Square. And when the accidental fire broke out, 500 people working there that day, almost all of them female. 2/3 of them were Jewish, and 1/4 of them were Italian, and almost everything that could be wrong was wrong with the building. And the fire company came very quickly. They rolled up the ladder, and it only went to the 6th floor. The fire was on 8, 9, and 10, a minimum of 30 feet away from where the ladders could go. In 1911, we had over 100 buildings higher than 6 stories, and not one fire ladder went up that high. So this tells you where the fire started. People got onto a fire escape, pulled away from the wall, killing them. 80 people jumped from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, and all of them died. 146 deaths. 500 people in the middle of labor unrest. Had a big effect on the city, big outcry in the square. And one woman who was nearby was Frances Perkins. I'll show you a picture of her in a minute, but suddenly people are politicized even more. Frances Perkins was FDR, when he was governor of New York State, appointed her to be the head of the, I think, called the New York State Consumer Organization. And she was a witness, like many of the original people who saw the fire. She said, I wonder why the owner is throwing out burning bales of fabric, and then realized that was a person jumping. When FDR becomes US president in 1933, she becomes the first woman ever to be in a presidential cabinet. She was the US Secretary of Labor from 1933 to 1945 when he dies, and the Labor building in Washington was named for her. So Frances Perkins, under her watch, Social Security, minimum wage, child labor laws were passed, quite a huge effect. She said to FDR, I won't be the Secretary of Labor unless you bring in Social Security. And many of us are very happy she's doing Mary Kingsbury Simkovich, she starts the local settlement house. That means instead of throwing your money across town, hoping it will help people, people of means, people of education should settle among the poor. And of course, Greenwich House still going very strong. She helped people get past the citizenship test on the roof. A lot of the kids had some physical activity. Many of the Italians in particular came from farms where the food was fresh and the sun was on you. A lot of tuberculosis came to them when they moved into the crowded tenements in the city here. This is, I just wondered, this name. No. Elizabeth Irwin. This is Elizabeth Irwin, who thought of a whole new way to teach children. She said, you teach by doing, not by hearing. She institutes school trips, and of course, Little Red Schoolhouse on Bleecker is what she began. Elizabeth Irwin High School, named for her in the village today. Psychological tests, a huge effect. Many of her ideas, of course, are much more mainstream today, but they were very radical then. She was bounced from her public school job because the principal said all the parents really want is for the kids to be able to take the right change when they go to the store. She got Emma Goldman, she was one of the speakers, anarchist, into free love. What does the government have to do with marriage? She didn't understand that. Pushing for birth control. One of the speakers at the Mable Dodge salon. This is Margaret Sanger. She was an obstetrical nurse and working in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And many of her patients were women who had many kids and could not risk their marriage by saying no to their husband. And when she started sending contraceptive information around the country, the feds were after her, obscene information through the mail. But going to the Mable Dodge salon, I guess, gave her some kind of extra support. Yeah. Ida Tarbell, she took on Standard Oil, 2 huge volumes that came out in 1904, having done it in serial form in McClure's magazine. And they say that before her books came out, people did not understand what a trust was, what a huge, huge business was. Her books even convinced Teddy Roosevelt to bust the trusts, because once her 2 huge volumes came out, people didn't have a stomach for big business anymore. She had been in Paris for many years herself. This is Dorothy Thompson, who in the 1930s was the second most famous woman in America after Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was one of the first people, she was a journalist, one of the first people in Europe to blow the whistle on what was happening in Germany. Married to Sinclair Ruth in Washington Square North. This is a woman who starts the Liberal Club, which was a kind of a coalescing of people who had disagreements with many things in society. Rodman was her name, and the liberal club she belonged to in Gramercy Park did not admit blacks, which she opposed, and so she moves it to McDougal Street, and it becomes a very important thing. Women who got married and were teaching in the public school were fired. Didn't even have to be pregnant. Men were not fired if they got married, but women were, and so that was one of her big issues. The Liberal Club, this is what it looked like on McDougal Street. Crystal Eastman, a graduate of NYU Law School, helped start an organization that is today the ACLU. Whoops, sorry. Pushing for suffrage, even got some uptown women. This is Alva Smith Vanderbilt Belmont. She divorced Vanderbilt, nobody divorced Vanderbilt, and married Belmont, who she loved very much, and then when he dies, she joins the suffrage fight. And had some very creative things. I know at the Jefferson Market Courthouse, when this was a courthouse, the judge said, you know, for the women who were arresting on the strike in 1909, their bail is, I don't know, $50 or something, and would anybody put up the bail? And she said, well, I don't have any cash on me, but can I put up my Fifth Avenue mansion as security? Very newsworthy kind of woman. Killed a lot of birds with those hats, though. This is Inez Milholland, who was a lawyer for some of the women at Triangle, and in the suffrage parades, very theatrically would lead the parades sitting on a white horse. But she does not live to see suffrage pass because she dies largely of exhaustion and I think pernicious anemia. She marries Eugène Boissevin before he marries, after she dies, he marries Edna St. Vincent Millay. Well, look at there we are on the right, and on the left is, of course, you see the Sixth Avenue L in the front. That's the Women's House of Detention from the 1930s on. It's now, of course, the wonderful Rose Garden, but that's where a lot of women were incarcerated. All she did was anonymously write and star in a Broadway show with the title Sex. And the woman who enjoyed it was not punished in the show, so they indicted her here. She got, Mae West, of course, is what I'm talking about. She got 10 days in the workhouse, and as soon as they arrested her, she said very accurately, I believe this will be the making of me. Well, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg was incarcerated at the Women's House of Detention until she and her husband were taken to Sing Sing and electrocuted as being Soviet spies. You may know that after the KGB files were opened after the Soviet Union fell, it turned out that there's a good chance he was a spy, but she was not. Eleanor Roosevelt, I mean, how great can the population be? Lived at 29 Washington Square West, the plaque was up there showing it. And people just loved her. She just listened to people and cared about people, and of course communicated a lot of this feeling to her husband, and it had an effect on the laws of the country. There's a famous, I don't think I have a picture of it, but one of my favorite cartoons about her is Deep, Deep in a Mine. And the miners look up and said, oh, there's Mrs. Roosevelt. Well, she went every place. Jane Jacobs. You know, somebody said to Robert Moses, why do you run a 2-lane highway through Washington Square? And he said, absolutely not, 4-lane. So she was one of the people that led that. He's been called a barracuda city planner. I know now some people were saying in the recent book that he added some things, Jane Jacobs added some things. But he put her down. He said, she's just a housewife. Why are we supposed to listen to her? But in her time, I think the Death and Life of the American Cities comes out around 1962, and they were demolishing, you know, building super blocks like you have near NYU now, and putting up big towers in plazas. So you couldn't keep an eye out on your kid, and there were none of the eyes on the street that she proclaimed make a neighborhood safe. But she stuck with it. Great picture of Bella, who lived in 25th. Now, of course, there's a plaque to her in front of 25th. And Bella and Bella. She was very involved in the anti-war movement, Women's Strike for Peace, represented the city at the House of Representatives. In your face. Great feminist. Isn't that strange? No hat, even in the dentist chair. The New Yorker, when she died, the New Yorker had a cartoon in front of St. Peter. He's saying to her, welcome to, and she batted down the door. She didn't wait for St. Peter to admit her. Sonia Sotomayor lived on Bedford Street before being appointed by Obama to the court. Incredible woman. The guy where she bought coffee every day had no idea she was even a judge. She just talked Spanish, that's all. And I like to end with this, to quote the great Condon Green in the play Wonderful Town, who knows what future greats live in these twisted alleys. And I hope you enjoyed the talk.